Chapter 1. A Death Beneath the Stars. The Devonshire moorlands had a way of whispering to those who lingered too long beneath their skies. Wild and wide, the landscape gave off a hush, like a secret half-spoken. On such an evening, with stars pricking the darkness like distant fires, the century-old observatory of the Devonshire Astronomical Society glowed like a lantern atop the hills. Inside, everything shimmered. Chandeliers blazed above tuxedoed scholars and diamond-adorned dowagers. A string quartet played a Vivaldi concerto. The air smelled faintly of orchids and old books. The guest list was a curious mixture: academics, collectors, and the aristocracy, drawn together by a common fascination with the cosmos. At the heart of the room stood a velvet-draped pedestal, and on it the evening's true jewel, an antique brass telescope, said to be a relic from Galileo's personal workshop. "Recovered from Lord Silas's forgotten wine cellar," announced Rupert Greaves with a performative smile. "We believe it to be the legendary Specula Celeste, estimated value in the millions." He paused for effect, letting the crowd gasp and murmur. Lady Venetia Street James, wrapped in a silver shawl, leaned toward her companion, Major Bertram Hargrove. "How convenient, don't you think? The telescope vanishes for half a century and reappears just when Rupert's estate is drowning in debt." Bertram grunted. "Rumours. Rupert's always been an odd duck, but hardly a fraud." "Perhaps not," Venetia replied, sipping her champagne. "But desperate men do desperate things." A short distance away, Dr. Margot Fenley, the Society's reclusive historian, stood stiffly beside the telescope. Her face, pale and drawn, twitched with unease. She looked not at the relic, but at the corridor behind her, as though something there had turned her bones to ice. Then came a voice, polished, polite. "Excuse me, madame, but you seem troubled." The man who spoke was elegant, not tall but precise in every detail. His moustache curled impeccably at both ends. His eyes, though soft, held a quiet flame of calculation. He held out a gloved hand to Dr. Fenley. "I am Hercule Poirot," he said gently, "and though I am here merely as an invited guest of Lord Greaves, I cannot help but observe that you are either very nervous or very afraid." Dr. Fenley blinked at him as if waking from a bad dream. Oh, forgive me, Monsieur Poirot, it's just the pressure of the evening, the return of this telescope. I suppose it has stirred old memories." "Memories," said Poirot softly, "can be most dangerous things, especially when one has tried to forget them." Before she could answer, there came a crash, the sound of glass shattering, a gasp, then a scream that sliced through the revelry. People turned. At the far end of the hall, beneath a stained glass dome, lay the body of Dr. Margot Fenley, flat on her back, still. A server screamed. Lady Venetia dropped her glass. Rupert turned pale. Poirot was already moving. "She's not breathing!" cried Archibald Crane, the Society's treasurer, kneeling beside the fallen woman. Poirot knelt calmly, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. He checked her wrist. Then he stood, slowly. "She is dead," he said, with finality. The observatory fell into stunned silence, but Poirot's eyes were not on the corpse. They were on the brass telescope, and the faint smear of something dark along its rim. A whisper of poison, a secret long buried, and the stars above, cold and silent, watching. Chapter 2. The First Clues. A gentle rain had begun to tap against the glass dome of the observatory. The festive glow of the gala had dimmed into shocked murmurs, hushed voices, and the shuffling of uneasy feet. The musicians had long ceased playing. The once proud centennial celebration now felt like the aftermath of a grand performance, interrupted by an unforgiving truth. Hercule Poirot stood beside the body of Dr. Margot Fenley, his hands calmly folded before him. Around them a small group had gathered: Rupert Greaves, pale and sweating; Archibald Crane, trembling and ashen; Major Hargrove, arms crossed in military tension; and Lady Venetia, her expression unreadable behind dark eyes. Poirot broke the silence. "No one must leave the premises." Rupert blinked. "Monsieur Poirot, surely this was an accident. She fainted, perhaps? She had a heart condition, I believe." Poirot tilted his head. "Then why," he said softly, "is there the faint scent of bitter almonds on her lips?" Rupert swallowed. So did Archibald. Lady Venetia lifted an eyebrow. "You mean cyanide?" "Possibly," Poirot replied. "But we must not jump to conclusions. Hastings, mon ami." He turned to the man beside him, a sandy-haired gentleman in evening dress who had remained quietly at Poirot's side. "Yes, Poirot?" "Kindly fetch the constable stationed outside. The local police must seal the observatory immediately." Hastings nodded and disappeared toward the main doors. Poirot returned to Margot's body, crouching delicately. He examined her clutch bag, opened it with gloved fingers, and noted a folded letter tucked within. He read the first line, then folded it shut. His expression did not change, but his eyes flicked toward Rupert. "She had written something," he said aloud. "Something meant to be delivered, and yet she did not post it. Curieux, n'est-ce pas?" Archibald cleared his throat. "Are you suggesting someone murdered her to prevent her from speaking?" Poirot didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned toward the brass telescope. It now seemed to dominate the room, more sinister than noble. Poirot ran a handkerchief along the rim and examined the faint residue. He sniffed very carefully. Then he smiled faintly. "Mon Dieu," he said, "how perfectly logical." Lady Venetia crossed her arms. "I don't suppose you'd care to share with the rest of us what's so logical about poisoning a timid, aging historian in the middle of a gala?" Poirot turned to her gently. "It is not the historian, madame, who is the true target. It is the history she threatened to reveal." Before she could reply, Hastings returned, accompanied by a local constable, a ruddy-faced man named Sergeant Lowry. Lowry looked simultaneously overwhelmed and determined. "Evening all," he said gruffly. "Heard there's been a death?" Poirot stepped forward. "Yes, Sergeant. Dr. Margot Fenley, esteemed historian of this society, has died under most suspicious circumstances. I suspect poison, though I defer, of course, to your official channels." Lowry scratched his head. "Right. I'll secure the scene and call the coroner straight away." "Merci," Poirot said, "and kindly ensure that no guest leaves. We are in what one might call a closed circle." He turned back to Rupert. "Monsieur Greaves, may I ask who had access to the telescope prior to the unveiling?" Rupert hesitated. "Well, I suppose only myself and Dr. Fenley. We'd spent the morning arranging the display. Archibald joined us later to finalize the lighting, but that's all, really." "Anyone else?" Rupert frowned. "The hired help, perhaps. A catering boy came and went. A young fellow, fair-haired, maybe 19 or 20. Poirot nodded. "Find him, please, discreetly." As Rupert moved away, Poirot turned his attention to the room itself. "Let us not forget," he said to Hastings, "that this telescope reappeared after 50 years of silence, and now, within days of its return, someone connected to it is murdered." Hastings frowned. "You think there's more to the telescope than just historic value?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Mon ami, I am convinced of it." As the night wore on, the observatory emptied of its guests, leaving only a handful of staff and those closest to the deceased. Poirot remained standing by the artifact, arms behind his back. In the distance, thunder rolled softly over the moors. A secret had been buried with Dr. Margot Fenley. But Poirot knew secrets, like stars, are never gone. Only hidden. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. Morning came slowly over Dartmoor, veiled in mist. The observatory, still sealed by police order, now seemed less a monument to science and more a mausoleum of secrets. The rain had stopped, but a damp chill lingered in the air, clinging to stone and skin alike. Inside, the main hall had been repurposed into a temporary drawing room. The ornate velvet chairs, once arranged for the gala, now sat in a rough circle. In their centre stood Hercule Poirot, immaculate, unhurried, and in command. Inspector Colin Barnes of the Devonshire Constabulary, freshly arrived, stood near the door, flipping through a small notebook. Young, competent, and quietly sceptical, he had taken Poirot's presence with polite professionalism. "You've already spoken to most of them, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "But you're welcome to lead, I'll observe." Poirot gave a modest bow. "Merci, Inspector. One sees much when the suspects do not feel under direct scrutiny." He turned his gaze to the assembled figures. 7 individuals remained in the building, each now considered not merely a guest but a possible participant in murder. Rupert Greaves-Tall, angular, and dressed in yesterday's crumpled tuxedo, Rupert sat stiffly, his hands clamped between his knees. As heir to the Greaves estate and organizer of the Centennial Gala, he'd been the telescope's biggest promoter. But the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed unease. His fingers tapped incessantly, anxious, rhythmic. Lady Venetia Street, James. Poised and composed as ever, Lady Venetia wore a fresh cream silk blouse and gloves despite the informal setting. A patroness of the society and once rumoured to be romantically entangled with the late Lord Silas, she exuded cold sophistication. Her eyes, however, darted from face to face with quiet calculation. Major Bertram Hargrove, retired military, grey-haired and thick-necked. Bertram sat with arms crossed and jaw tight. He'd served alongside Lord Silas in Burma and was known for his temper and loyalty. "The whole business reeks of melodrama," he'd muttered earlier. "Poison. At a gala? Nonsense." Archibald Crane. The society's treasurer, a soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually hunched posture. He seemed nervous, even more so now, frequently adjusting his collar as though it were shrinking. Clara Newton, Dr. Fenley's assistant, young and sharp-eyed, with a notebook always in hand. She had arrived late to the gala, citing an unexpected train delay. Her demeanour was subdued, but her eyes never left the telescope for long. Leo, the caterer's assistant. The youngest present, no more than 20, Leo had served drinks at the gala. He looked stunned, out of place in his catering whites, and sat on the edge of his seat like he might bolt at any moment. Professor Alton Greeley, a visiting American astronomer from Yale with wild silver hair and a booming voice. "The Galileo telescope," he'd declared dramatically the previous night, "is a fraud. No one had paid him much mind then. They were now." Poirot studied each face in silence. "Let us begin," he said. "Last night Dr. Fenley died. We suspect poison, possibly administered through contact with the telescope. What I seek to understand is not only who might have had the opportunity, but who had the motive." A murmur rippled through the group. "I assure you, Poirot," said Rupert tightly, "Margot had no enemies here." No enemies? Then why was she carrying an unsigned letter written in haste and never sent? Lady Venetia's voice cut through. "What did it say?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "That, madam, I shall reveal soon enough, for Now I ask each of you to remain within the observatory until Inspector Barnes and I conclude our interviews. I will speak to you all, one by one." Major Hargrove let out a grunt. "And while you ask your clever little questions, the real killer may already be planning their next move." "Ah," Poirot said gently. "But you see, Major, the killer cannot move freely, not when they believe the walls are closing in, and I intend to make them feel exactly that." A sudden gust rattled the observatory windows. Leo flinched. Clara clutched her notebook tighter. Archibald turned away, fiddling with his watch. And Lady Venetia, lips pursed, said, "You enjoy this, don't you, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Madame, I do not enjoy murder, but I am very fond of the truth." His eyes drifted once more to the telescope, a gleam of brass and a trail of lies. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. The sun had risen reluctantly over Dartmoor, casting long shadows across the dewy grass and granite stones that framed the observatory. Though it was morning, the chill in the air and the heaviness in the rooms made time feel arrested, caught between a celebration that had soured and a crime not yet understood. Within the main hall, the scent of polish and old paper lingered, mingling faintly with something sharper, perhaps the memory of almonds or simply the weight of suspicion. The telescope still stood on its pedestal like a silent sentinel. Dr. Fenley's body had been respectfully removed, but the impression of death remained. Poirot had risen early, as was his habit. He now stood near the eastern windows, immaculately dressed in a dove-grey suit, a dark rose in his lapel. He looked not at the telescope, nor at the floor where Fenley had fallen, but out beyond the moors, lost in quiet thought. It was not until Hastings joined him, nursing a second cup of coffee, that he spoke. "There is a balance, Hastings, between the movements of the heavens and the chaos of men. One might believe that in a place dedicated to celestial order, human emotion would be tamed, but none. Murder still finds its way through marble doors and polished brass." Hastings followed his gaze, frowning slightly. "You think it's about more than the telescope?" Poirot turned, gently lifting his moustache with one finger. "Always, mon ami. There is pride here. Greed, perhaps, and fear. I felt it in the air last night before the death. Someone knew what was coming, or feared it would come." Before Hastings could reply, the heavy oak doors of the hall creaked open. Inspector Barnes entered with purposeful steps, followed by Sergeant Lowry, who looked as though he hadn't slept. Barnes nodded to Poirot. "The coroner's report confirms your suspicion, Monsieur Poirot. Traces of cyanide in the bloodstream, likely absorbed through the skin. We're examining the telescope's brass fittings now, specifically the eyepiece. Could have been laced." Poirot nodded calmly. "It would require precision. Cyanide in such a form is not easy to handle. The killer must have known exactly when and how she would touch it." Barnes flipped open his notebook. "We've begun interviewing the key guests. Several mentioned Dr. Fenley seemed on edge." Poirot glanced toward the empty seat she'd once occupied. "Indeed, and yet she chose to remain. Why?" Barnes raised a brow. "Guilt? Or," Poirot said softly, "a sense of duty. She had something to reveal, something she feared but could not leave unsaid." The inspector gestured toward the long side corridor. "We've cleared a room for private questioning. You're welcome to use it." "Merci. I believe it is time I begin." As Poirot moved toward the corridor, Hastings trailed behind. "Well, who first?" Poirot consulted his pocket notebook. "Rupert Greaves, the host, the inheritor, the showman. He will wish to appear composed, but grief or shock will leave fingerprints even on polished souls." The interview room was modest, a study of some kind with oak shelves and a wide window that framed the misty moors. Poirot took a seat behind the desk as Rupert entered, his gait slightly uneven. "Rupert," Poirot began warmly, "do sit. I promise this will not be unpleasant unless you insist upon lies." Rupert chuckled nervously, taking the chair opposite. "You're very direct. I find time to be precious when the truth is delayed. Let us begin. You claimed last night that the telescope was discovered in your family vaults?" "Yes. 2 weeks ago, we were preparing for the gala, going through some of my late uncle's old collections. It was Clara, Dr. Fenley's assistant, who noticed the brass casing. We had it cleaned, authenticated." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Was it truly authenticated?" Rupert hesitated. "As far as we could tell. Professor Greeley believes it's a replica, but we've had no formal challenge. To be honest, the press coverage helped. The society was in desperate need of funding." "Ah," said Poirot softly. "So this telescope was not just a relic. It was a rescue." Rupert lowered his eyes. "You make it sound like a crime." "I merely note that desperation, like cyanide, is invisible until it strikes." Rupert looked up, startled. Poirot smiled gently and closed his notebook. "That is all for now." As Rupert left the room, Poirot tapped his fingers together. Hastings, watching, asked, "What did you see?" Poirot replied quietly, "A man afraid of being caught, but not, I think, for murder." Outside, the wind began to rise once more, and the truth, as ever, stirred with it. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The study had grown quiet again, the moors outside stretching endlessly beneath the pale, cloud-swathed sky. Poirot remained seated at the small desk, arms folded neatly, eyes fixed on the door. A faint ticking from the grandfather clock filled the silence. Hastings sat nearby, pen poised. There was a knock. "Entrez," Poirot called. Lady Venetia Street James stepped into the room, elegance incarnate in a dove-grey dress and black gloves. She did not sit immediately, but regarded Poirot coolly. "I assume we're all to be interrogated like criminals?" she said. "Not at all, madame," Poirot replied with a slight bow. "Only like witnesses, who may be lying." She arched an eyebrow, then sat. "Your relationship with Dr. Fenley, Lady Venetia, how would you describe it?" "Professional, cordial. We spoke occasionally at society functions. I admired her knowledge, but she was not socially fluent." "Did she confide in you?" Venetia gave a soft laugh. "Goodness, no. Margot wasn't the type for confidences, timid as a rabbit." Poirot's gaze remained steady. "Yet rabbits can bite when cornered." She looked at him now, closely. "She seemed distracted last night," Venetia admitted. "She pulled me aside briefly during the second toast, whispered something odd." "Odd?" "She asked me if I had ever read Lord Silas's private journals. I told her, no, I hadn't even known they existed." "And her response?" She nodded, muttered, "That explains a great deal," and walked away. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Merci, madame. One more question, if I may. Where were you when the incident occurred?" "In the West Gallery, beside Major Hargrove. We both heard the crash and ran toward it." Poirot nodded slowly. "That will be all, for now." Lady Venetia rose and left with a regal turn of her head. Next was Archibald Crane. He entered quietly, hands wringing his hat, eyes darting about the room like a man unused to scrutiny. Poirot gestured toward the seat. "Monsieur Crane, treasurer of the Devonshire Astronomical Society, a position of trust, n'est-ce pas?" I suppose," Crane stammered. "I manage accounts, grants, donations. You also helped organize the gala?" "Yes." Rupert handled the guest list. I oversaw logistics, budget, security, staffing. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Did you notice anything unusual about the telescope prior to the event? Crane hesitated. It was cleaned, polished. Margot supervised most of that. I remember her being especially cautious, wouldn't let anyone else touch it. Did she seem afraid? Worried, yes. She confided in me briefly, said something about a forgery scandal that could destroy the society's reputation. I told her not to be paranoid. Poirot glanced at Hastings, who scribbled a note. And you, Monsieur Crane, where were you at the moment of her collapse? I'd stepped into the back pantry to speak with Leo, the caterer's assistant. He was asking about where to stack the empty trays. I only heard the crash. Poirot's eyes twinkled. And when you returned, you immediately knelt beside her. Crane nodded. She was
already gone. Poirot's gaze lingered. That will be all. As Crane exited, Hastings said quietly. He looked truly shaken. Yes, Poirot murmured, but whether by grief or guilt, we shall see. He rang the bell. Clara Newton entered. Young, sharp and plain-faced, Clara clutched a leather notebook as if it were armor. You were Dr. Fenley's assistant, mademoiselle, Poirot said. How well did you know her? Professionally, Clara replied. She was distant, but brilliant. We worked together closely over the last 6 months, preparing the gala exhibits. Did she trust you? I think so. She gave me access to her research files. Poirot tilted his head. Including the Greaves estate documents. Clara hesitated. Yes. She believed the telescope's sudden discovery was staged. She suspected Rupert was hiding something. And did she find anything to prove that? Clara opened her notebook and flipped to a folded page. She passed it to Poirot without a word. He read silently. It was a list. Dates, shipping manifests, estate receipts. One line was circled, 1872, purchase of duplicate Galileo model, Florence, never declared. Poirot's brows lifted. Intriguing. You did not share this with anyone else? No, Clara whispered. Not even Margot. She died before I could show her. Poirot folded the note. Merci. One final question. Where were you at the time of her death? Clara looked down. In the archive room, organizing her papers. I didn't even know she had left the main floor. Poirot gave a slow nod. That is all, mademoiselle. As Clara left, Hastings leaned closer. A forgery? So the telescope may be fake? Poirot tapped the paper. Or worse, real and stolen? Outside the door, footsteps echoed faintly. Another truth was waiting to be unearthed, and Poirot's little grey cells were just beginning to stir. Chapter 6. The first false lead. The mist thickened outside the observatory, blurring the edges of trees and turning the world a shade quieter. Inside, however, the atmosphere grew heavier with every word spoken. Poirot's interviews had begun to form a pattern of secrets carefully guarded and glances shared with too much meaning. After a light lunch served in the East Lounge, awkwardly quiet and half-eaten, Poirot returned to the study. There, a name had risen to the surface. Leo Hensley, the caterer's assistant. A boy with no obvious connection to the society or the telescope, yet whose movements during the gala had begun to attract more than casual notice. Poirot requested that Leo be brought in next. The young man entered hesitantly, eyes darting from the window to Poirot, to the corner of the room, as if seeking an escape route. He was thin, wiry, with an unruly mop of fair hair and fingers that twitched when idle. "You are Leo, yes?" Poirot asked gently. "You served drinks and canapes at the gala?" Nodded. "Yes, sir." "You were near Dr. Fenley at the time of her collapse?" He swallowed hard. I don't know. I was walking past the exhibit hall. She was standing near the telescope. Then I heard a glass smash and people shouting. Poirot leaned forward. And did you speak to Dr. Fenley before that? Leo hesitated. Maybe once, earlier. She asked me to fetch her water. I remember because she was very specific. No ice, no lemon. Did she seem nervous? Sort of. It looked like she was expecting someone. Keep looking at the main doors. Did she say anything else? Leo looked down. She asked if I'd seen a man in a blue coat. Said he might be trying to pass as staff. Hastings raised an eyebrow. An intruder? Poirot's gaze sharpened. Interesting. Leo shifted uncomfortably. That's all she said, I swear. I didn't see anyone suspicious. Poirot's eyes drifted to Leo's sleeves, rolled up slightly, revealing a faint red mark on the side of his wrist. It looked recent. Tell me, Leo, he said softly. How did you get that bruise? Leo flushed. I burned it, while stacking hot trays. Poirot didn't press further. Very well, he said. Merci, monsieur. As Leo left the room, Inspector Barnes entered swiftly, holding a small paper bag in gloved hands. Poirot, you'll want to see this. He placed the bag on the desk and pulled out a folded cloth. Inside it lay a small metal vial, round, tarnished, and old. The faint scent of almonds was unmistakable. Found it hidden behind the curtain rail in the rear storage room, Barnes said grimly. Empty now, but trace tests confirm it held cyanide. Guess who we saw sneaking toward that area this morning? Poirot said nothing. Leo, Barnes continued, said he was looking for his apron. Poirot raised a brow. A most unfortunate coincidence. I think we've got our man. Poor background, no fixed address, opportunity to poison the telescope unnoticed. Maybe Margot saw him tampering with it. Poirot's fingers steepled. It is possible, but I caution you, Inspector, circumstance does not equal guilt. A boy working odd jobs would have neither motive nor means to obtain cyanide easily. And the telescope, it was locked behind display ropes and under guard. He could have slipped through or been hired by someone. Poirot stood slowly, walked to the window and stared out toward the moor. There is a method in this murder, he murmured. Not desperation, but design. Precision. A killer who knew chemistry and history. He turned back. Still, bring Leo in again. Tell him we found the vial and gauge his reaction. As Barnes exited to retrieve the boy, Hastings leaned in. You don't think he did it? Poirot shook his head. No, mon ami. He is a frightened rabbit, perhaps hiding something, but not murder. Then why plant the vial near his path? Poirot
smiled faintly. Ah, now you ask the right question. Why indeed? Moments later, a scuffle echoed in the corridor. Leo had bolted. They caught him by the coat just outside the west wing. It was enough, Barnes declared, enough to detain him. But Poirot, watching the scene unfold, felt the first tug of something else, something wrong. The pieces were falling too quickly, too neatly, and in Poirot's world, that was never a sign of truth. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. Rain tapped softly against the windows as evening crept over Dartmoor once more, turning the observatory into a dim-lit sanctuary of whispered suspicions and watchful silences. The chandelier overhead cast long, golden shadows across the floor, and the brass telescope, draped again in velvet, stood like a relic from another age, a silent centerpiece to a crime still unresolved. In the drawing-room, Hercule Poirot sat alone by the hearth, his fingers steepled, his moustache unmoving. A fire crackled softly beside him, but he barely acknowledged it. His mind, ever exact, was arranging facts not in rows but in layers, human emotion, contradiction, pride, and deceit. Footsteps approached. It was Inspector Barnes, frustration lining his face. Leo won't say another word, he announced. Swears he didn't know what the vial was, said someone must have planted it. We'll keep him overnight. Poirot looked up. Let him rest. He has played his part, whether knowingly or not. Barnes frowned. You still don't believe he did it? No, Poirot said. He ran because he panicked, not because he was guilty. The boy is a pawn inspector, the killer. They are far more refined. Hastings entered behind the inspector. Then who? You've interviewed nearly everyone. Poirot's gaze sharpened. We shall find out, if we listen not only to what they say, but how they say it. He stood. Bring in Major Bertram Hargrove next. Minutes later, the Major strode into the study, posture rigid, his military moustache twitching ever so slightly. You've called me in again, Monsieur Poirot, he said brusquely. I hope this doesn't take long. I do apologize, Major, Poirot said smoothly, but I found myself puzzled by your account last night. You claimed to have stood with Lady Venetia at the time of the incident. Yes. Poirot gave a small nod. Lady Venetia confirmed that. However, when I asked her what Dr. Fenley said earlier in the evening, she told me Margot inquired about Lord Silas's personal journals. Bertram stiffened. And what does that have to do with me? Curious, isn't it? You were Lord Silas's closest friend. You fought beside him. You visited the estate often. Bertram said nothing. Poirot leaned forward. What might those journals contain, Major? Perhaps something about the telescope, or the men who handled it during the war years? Bertram's brow furrowed. Are you suggesting Silas
Smuggled antiques? That's absurd. Is it? In 1944, British intelligence intercepted several crates sent from Florence. Some were unaccounted for after the war. Some, like this telescope, vanished. Lord Silas served in Italy. Bertram's jaw clenched. I'm not here to defend a dead man's past. No, Poirot said softly, but you are here to defend your own. Dr. Fenley may have uncovered something about those years, something that tied you, and perhaps others, to the reappearance of this artifact. Bertram rose sharply. I don't have to listen to this. You do if you wish to clear your name. Bertram froze, anger flaring in his eyes, but then he slowly sat back down. I don't know what Fenley found, he said quietly. But if she'd found something in those journals... Yes, it might embarrass some people. She wasn't wrong to be afraid. Poirot studied him a moment longer, then dismissed him with a polite gesture. As the door shut behind him, Poirot motioned to Hastings. Next, Professor Alton Greeley. The American entered with an air of irritation. He was red-faced, his spectacles fogged, and his tie slightly crooked. You're still poking around, he grumbled. This is a waste of time. The woman died of poison. Question the staff, not me. Poirot remained unfazed. But it was you, monsieur, who announced publicly that the telescope was a forgery. Greeley snorted. It is. And yet you remained here. Why? Greeley shifted. Because I wanted a closer look. Even a forgery can reveal something if you know where to look. Did you speak to Dr. Fenley that evening? Yes, briefly. She seemed upset that I questioned the telescope's origin. Poirot tilted his head. Did she mention a letter? No. You are quite certain? I'm not in the habit of lying, Monsieur Poirot. No, Poirot said, smiling faintly. But you are in the habit of being distracted. Your outburst about the forgery, it drew attention, no? Just enough noise to muddy the waters. Greeley's eyes narrowed. Are you accusing me? I am observing, Poirot replied coolly, and I find your timing impeccable. With a terse nod, the professor left the room. Poirot turned to Hastings. Now we begin to see the threads, mon ami. Someone feared exposure. Someone who knew the telescope's secret long before it was unveiled. And you think Margot Fenley discovered it? Hastings asked. Poirot's gaze darkened. Number, I believe she confirmed it, which is why she had to be silenced. In the fireplace, a log cracked in two, and Poirot knew the real pressure was only just beginning. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. Dusk fell like a velvet curtain over the moor. The observatory's lights cast amber halos through the mist, making the building glow like a ghostly lantern amid the heather. Inside, the atmosphere had grown taut. The murder of Dr. Fenley had shaken
The foundation of the Devonshire Astronomical Society, but the unease had begun to evolve into something deeper, something colder. In the drawing room, Poirot sat with Inspector Barnes and Hastings, reviewing notes, when the door flung open. Clara Newton stood in the doorway, pale as parchment. "It's gone," she whispered. Poirot rose at once. "What is gone, mademoiselle?" Clara struggled to breathe. "The journal. Dr. Fenley's private notebook. It's missing." Barnes was on his feet. "Where was it?" "In her personal filing box. I locked it in the archive room this morning, just before breakfast. I went now to retrieve it, and it's gone, completely gone. The box is still there, but the key was forced." Hastings gave a low whistle. "Someone stole it?" Poirot's eyes glinted. "Non, mon ami. Someone is very afraid." They moved swiftly to the archive room. The space, long and narrow, lined with shelves and dusty volumes, smelled of old paper and lemon polish. At the far end sat a modest grey cabinet. One of the drawers hung slightly ajar. Poirot examined the lock. "Forced, but not clumsily," he murmured. "A practised hand." He turned to Clara. "Who knew about the cabinet?" "Just myself and Archibald. He helped me organize the records last week. But the cabinet was locked all day." Poirot looked at the papers still inside. Accounting ledgers, correspondence, guest lists, neatly stacked, undisturbed. Only one thing had been taken. "What exactly was in the journal?" Barnes asked. Clara bit her lip. Dr. Fenley kept notes on her research into the telescope, cross-references with shipping manifests, war records, donor logs. She had suspicions the telescope wasn't just lost, but deliberately hidden. "And did the journal mention names?" Poirot asked softly. Clara nodded. "She wrote about a name she'd uncovered, someone connected to the 1872 Florence acquisition. I hadn't seen the page, but she was planning to show me after the gala." Poirot's expression darkened. "Then that name was worth killing for." Barnes stepped back. "We'll need to question everyone again. Who had access to this room?" "Most of the senior members," Clara said. "Lady Venetia has a master key. So does Rupert. And Archibald." Poirot gently closed the drawer. "The murder of Dr. Fenley was to silence. The theft of her journal? That is to erase." They returned to the drawing room, where Hastings glanced at the windows, their panes reflecting the dim firelight. "Do you think the killer will strike again?" Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he turned to Barnes. "Let us begin with Archibald Crane." A few minutes later, the nervous treasurer entered, hands trembling slightly. "Another round of questions, I assume?" he said, trying to mask his unease. Poirot gestured toward a chair. "You helped Miss Newton with the archive files last week, yes?" "Yes, we reorganized the event materials and financial records." "Did you handle the keys to the grey cabinet?" "Only briefly. She locked everything when we were done." "And today? Did you return to the archive room?" "No," he said quickly. "Not once." Poirot leaned back. "Tell me, Monsieur Crane, you knew, Doctor. Fenley was investigating the telescope's provenance. You knew she was suspicious. Why did you not come forward with that information before now?" Archibald hesitated. I was frightened." She mentioned it weeks ago in passing, said there were inconsistencies in the donor records, but I didn't think she was serious. But she was, Poirot said gently. And now her most critical notes have vanished. Crane's eyes widened. You think I took them? I think, Poirot said softly, that you know who did. The room fell into a heavy silence. Crane looked down. Maybe I saw someone near the archives, just after lunch. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Who? Crane swallowed. Major Hargrove. He said he was looking for a quiet place to smoke his pipe. Poirot exchanged a glance with Barnes. Merci, monsieur, he said quietly. You may go. When Crane had left, Hastings exhaled. You think Hargrove took the journal? Poirot turned toward the fire. He has a motive, he has knowledge, but something tells me he is not clever enough to take only the journal and leave no trace behind. So who, then? Poirot's gaze drifted to the tall bookshelves, then to the locked doors beyond. The one who hides in plain sight. The one who has not yet made a mistake. He folded his hands and whispered, almost to himself, but they will. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The rain had settled into a cold, steady drizzle by the time Poirot returned to the lounge. The guests had dispersed into their own silences, clustering in shadowed corners or pacing hallways. Suspicion had spread like smoke, thin, acrid, and clinging. Poirot sat near the hearth again, eyes closed, not sleeping, but listening. The creak of floorboards, the flutter of pages turning, the murmur of a low conversation just beyond the corridor. Every sound mattered, every silence too. At last, he opened his eyes. Hastings, he said quietly, have you noticed how no one truly mourns Dr. Fenley? Hastings frowned. They've all been rather composed. Exactly. And yet she threatened them all, through knowledge, the journal, the research, the questions she asked. It is not grief they feel, it is a relief, laced with fear. Before Hastings could respond, a discreet knock came at the door. It was Clara Newton. I've remembered something, she said, stepping inside. Something strange? Poirot gestured for her to sit. Please, mademoiselle. It's about Lady Venetia, Clara said. Last week I brought Dr. Fenley some estate files that Rupert had forwarded. There was a handwritten note, paper clipped to one folder. It mentioned a private land sale made in 1946 from Lord Silas to a Miss V.S.J. Poirot leaned forward, eyes sharp. Lady Venetia Street, James Clara nodded. I asked Dr. Fenley if she thought it was important. She said very. Poirot's mind flicked instantly to the journals, missing, of course, but now with a new layer of urgency. Merci, Clara. You have helped more than you know. As Clara departed, Hastings muttered, So Venetia had a private deal with Lord Silas. Odd, considering she always claims she barely knew him. Poirot rose. Let us test her memory, shall we? He rang for Lady Venetia. She arrived with her usual poise, but there was something taut beneath the surface. Her smile was painted on too perfectly. Her gloves were immaculate despite the weather. You summoned me again, Monsieur Poirot? Indeed, madame. I was hoping to discuss your acquaintance with Lord Silas Greaves. I've already said I knew him only socially. Ah, Poirot replied mildly. Then perhaps it was another V.S.J. who purchased a parcel of land from him after the war. Venetia's eyes flickered. What? The sale was recorded in 1946. Quite a discreet transaction, paid in cash, no agents. A long pause, then Venetia's expression hardened. Very well. Yes, it was me. Poirot inclined his head. Merci for your honesty. I kept it quiet because I didn't want it linked to my family's finances, she said. I needed somewhere to live after the war, and Lord Silas offered me the land cheaply. He was fond of my late father. Poirot watched her carefully. And in return? She narrowed her eyes. Nothing improper, if that's what you're suggesting. But you have kept this connection secret for years. Venetia's jaw tightened. Because people like to imagine scandals. And because I suspect it was tied to something more complicated. Silas was moving assets, paintings, antiques. He hinted he'd used the land for storage. I didn't ask questions. Poirot tapped his fingers on the table. And you think Dr. Fenley found out? I think she knew more than she ever let on. She mentioned the land last week, asked if I'd ever dug beneath the old greenhouse. And had you? Venetia gave a grim smile. Number, but now I rather wish I had. Poirot nodded slowly. That'll be all for now, madame. After she departed, Hastings let out a low whistle. So the land could have been used to hide something. The telescope, perhaps. Possibly, Poirot murmured. Or other items equally rare, equally illegal. And Lady Venetia helped smuggle them? No, Poirot said. I believe she was used. Her name and property were convenient. She turned a blind eye, and perhaps someone ensured she remained silent, even now. At that moment, a folded note slipped under the door. Poirot picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sentence written in a rushed hand. Rupert has been lying about the discovery of the telescope. Meet me in the cellar. There was no signature. Poirot showed it to Hastings. A dangerous place to choose, non? You'll go? Of course, the liar always fears the listener. They found the cellar door unlocked. A narrow flight of stone steps descended into shadow. The air was damp and still. Shelves of old wine, dusty crates, and long unused furniture lined the walls. A single bulb buzzed overhead. They waited, and then, from the far corner, movement. A figure stepped forward. Clara. Poirot blinked. You sent the note? Clara shook her head. No, I found another letter, hidden behind the panel in the archive. It's from Lord Silas. You'll want to see it. She handed him a yellow envelope. Poirot opened it carefully. Inside, a typed letter. Galileo is genuine. Do not allow it to be shown. If discovered, it connects us all. Let it remain lost. The signature was unmistakable. S. G. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The web tightens, Hastings. And it seems the telescope may be far more than a relic. Poirot folded the letter. We are not merely chasing a murderer now, he said quietly. We are chasing history, rewritten through deceit. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. The cellar felt colder now, not because of the temperature, but because of what lay in Poirot's hands. The letter from Lord Silas, yellowed and creased with time, was damning in its brevity. It spoke not only of guilt, but of fear. Fear that the re-emergence of the telescope might unravel decades of carefully hidden truths. Poirot folded the letter neatly and tucked it inside his coat pocket. Merci, Mademoiselle Clara, he said. How long has this been hidden in the archive? Clara shook her head. I don't know. I found it wedged behind the wooden panel in the cabinet. It must have slipped there, or was put there deliberately. Perhaps Margot found it first. Then this, Poirot murmured, may have been what sealed her fate. They climbed back to the ground floor in silence. Poirot walked slower than usual, his expression unreadable. Hastings noticed the change. You've seen something, he said, as they passed the long gallery. Poirot said nothing, not yet. Instead, he paused in front of the telescope display. The instrument loomed in the dim light, its polished brass glinting faintly despite the velvet shroud. Poirot stepped forward and lifted the cover slightly, exposing the curved barrel and its elegant etchings. Then he bent down, very slowly, to the stand, and then it came, the smallest of frowns, barely perceptible. "What is it?" Hastings asked. Poirot rose and said simply, "Let us return to the study. There is something I must test." Back in the study, Poirot shut the door and went straight to the fireplace. He pulled the letter from Silas again, laid it flat on the desk, and studied the typed lines. "I noticed something strange when I picked it up," he said softly. He turned it over. There, pressed faintly into the paper, were creases, 4 of them in perfect symmetry. Not from folding, from something rectangular, once beneath it. Poirot fetched a clean sheet of paper and placed it over the letter. Then, taking a soft pencil, he gently shaded the area, revealing the faint outline of typed letters beneath. Not on the current page, but transferred, as if the letter had once rested atop another, recently written note. A message revealed by pressure. "What does it say?" Hastings leaned in. The ghost of words appeared, grainy and incomplete, but readable. "Transfer confirmed. The telescope arrives Sunday under Greaves's seal. Keep Fenley silent." Hastings drew in a breath. "Good heavens! A hidden draft," Poirot murmured. "This letter was used as a cover sheet while someone typed something else. More sinister. Likely the murderer." But why use this old letter? Because it was close at hand. Perhaps they used it to appear legitimate. Perhaps they never thought it would reveal anything. Poirot rose again and went to the fireplace. He stared into the flames as if expecting them to speak. "Someone used Lord Silas's legacy as a shield," he said. "But they were careless. They allowed their fear to rush them. And now they are trying to erase every trail." Hastings leaned forward. "So someone forged the Greaves seal to smuggle the telescope here recently, and Dr. Fenley discovered it wasn't an original rediscovery, but a cover-up." Poirot nodded. "Exactement." Then his gaze hardened. "And now we know it was not only a cover-up, it was a conspiracy." A sharp knock interrupted the moment. Inspector Barnes entered, holding a velvet pouch. "This was found in Rupert's room," he said. Inside the pouch was an old brass key, antique, ornate, and faintly rusted. "Looks like a storage key," Barnes added. One of the staff said it matched the padlocks used in the estate's unused carriage house. Poirot took it gently. "The very carriage house where the telescope may have been kept, before it was conveniently discovered. Should we open it?" Poirot hesitated. "Number, not yet." Barnes looked surprised. "If we move now, we alert the murderer," Poirot said. "I do not want them to destroy anything else." "But what if they're planning it already?" Poirot smiled coldly. "Then we must act. Just a little faster." He placed the pouch on the mantel. Then, turning to Hastings, he said, "Tomorrow morning we shall visit the carriage house, quietly, before anyone else is awake." Hastings nodded. "And tonight?" Poirot's eyes glimmered. "Tonight, mon ami, I will watch. I listen. And I wait." He tapped his temple. "The killer is clever, yes, but they do not know that their greatest mistake has already been made." Chapter 11. Tensions rise. By morning, the rain had ceased, leaving the moor shrouded in dew and silence. A pale light crept over the landscape, illuminating the worn stone paths of the estate. Inside the observatory, the tension had grown thick, unspoken but unmistakable, like the hum of static before a storm. Poirot rose early. He had slept little, his mind quietly orbiting the same points: motive, movement, misdirection. He dressed with care, as always, his moustache symmetrical, his collar sharp. By the time Hastings joined him in the foyer, Poirot was already buttoning his gloves. "Ready?" Hastings asked. Poirot nodded. "Let us visit the carriage house, but quietly, mon ami. We do not wish to disturb the hornet's nest, not just yet." They made their way across the gravel courtyard toward the estate's southern wing. The building in question sat half swallowed by ivy and time. The old carriage house, no longer used, was padlocked and shuttered, a structure most had forgotten. Poirot produced the antique key found in Rupert's room and turned it carefully in the rusted lock. It opened with a slow, stubborn groan. Inside, dust swirled in the light from high, broken windows. Stacked crates and covered furniture stood like forgotten statues. Poirot stepped forward, eyes alert. Near the back wall, under a tarpaulin, they found it, a long wooden crate, recently resealed. The shipping label was faded, but the remnants of a wax seal bore the unmistakable monogram S.G. Silas Greaves, Hastings breathed. Poirot examined the crate without opening it. "The telescope's twin," he murmured. "Or perhaps, the original." Either way, someone was planning a switch. He pointed to a small patch of sawdust beneath the crate. It was moved recently, and not by accident. Footsteps crunched behind them. They turned. It was Rupert Darnley, pale, dishevelled, and visibly furious. "What are you doing here?" he barked. "This building is off limits." "Off limits because you said so?" Poirot asked mildly. "Or because it hides what you do not want seen?" Rupert hesitated. "You have no authority." "I have curiosity, Monsieur Darnley, and that is often more powerful." Rupert took a step forward. "You have no idea what you're meddling in. That telescope was meant to restore this estate's reputation. I spent years locating it." "And yet," Poirot said, "it appears you found it far closer to home than you claimed." Rupert's lips tightened. "You think I poisoned Margot?" "I think?" Poirot said slowly. "You knew she was growing too curious, and I think you are not the only one who feared what she'd uncover." Rupert turned sharply and stormed out, his boots echoing on the stone floor. Hastings watched him go. That wasn't denial. "No," Poirot said, "but it was fear. He knows the walls are closing in." They returned to the main house just as breakfast was being laid out in the east salon. The guests sat around the long table, some silent, some bickering quietly. The air crackled. Poirot and Hastings entered without ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot said, "may I join you?" There were nods, a few forced smiles. Then, as Poirot took a seat, Venetia rose. "I can't stand this anymore," she said, trembling slightly. "We're all being treated like criminals." "No one is being treated so, madam," Poirot replied gently. "But we are all here because a woman was murdered and the killer is still among us." That caused a stir. Professor Greeley muttered, "If you have something to say, Poirot, say it plainly." Poirot's gaze moved slowly across the room. "I believe someone here orchestrated a smuggling operation involving the antique telescope. I believe that same person used poison to silence Dr. Fenley when she drew too close to the truth. And I believe that person is now attempting to destroy every trace of their involvement." Hargrove scoffed. "And you think a room full of well-bred scholars is behind a criminal conspiracy?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Not all scholars are innocent. Not all criminals are vulgar." He stood. "But let us test the strength of loyalty, shall we?" He turned to Archibald Crane. "Monsieur, do you still insist you did not enter the archive room yesterday afternoon?" Crane blinked. I told you. And yet someone saw you leaving the west corridor with a folded paper. Your hands were ink-stained." Crane looked panicked. I'd been revising the gala receipts." "Oh?" Poirot said mildly. "Receipts kept in the East Office?" Crane looked down. "Fine, I went to the archive, but only to retrieve a file Margot had borrowed. I didn't touch her cabinet." "But you were seen opening a drawer?" "Only to check if she'd returned it." Lady Venetia stood sharply. "He's lying!" Crane turned to her, stunned. "What?" You were always her lapdog. She controlled you with threats, and now you're trying to cover for Rupert, aren't you? Rupert rose. Don't drag me into this, Venetia. And then the room erupted. Accusations, old grievances, alliances breaking like glass. Poirot stood calmly in the midst of it, his eyes scanning, listening. This was the moment he had waited for, the fracture, the unravelling. When fear makes tongues loose and tempers betray the truth. Then someone said it. I should have burned that letter when I had the chance. The voice was soft, but Poirot heard it and smiled. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The breakfast salon emptied in uneasy silence. The final words from the heated exchange hung in the air like smoke. Someone, perhaps without realizing, had spoken too much. I should have burned that letter when I had the chance. A throwaway remark, perhaps, but Poirot had heard the crack in the voice, the stiffness in posture, the look of realization that followed. He filed it away. Now, in the solitude of the study, Poirot paced slowly before the tall windows as Inspector Barnes stood watching him, arms folded. You stirred the pot, Poirot, Barnes said, nearly had them clawing each other's eyes out. As expected, Poirot replied, pausing. Desperation brings mistakes, and it is in these mistakes that truth is born. He tapped his temple. Someone fears exposure. Someone was involved with the telescope's reappearance and its false origin story. Dr. Fenley, clever and meticulous, traced its true path. She documented it. She became a liability. Now someone tries to erase her, but they are not fast enough. Barnes nodded toward the table. And the letter from Lord Silas? A decoy, Poirot said, a fragment of the past, but the present is what concerns us now. He paused, then said, Bring me Clara Newton. When she arrived, Poirot greeted her with a nod and gestured toward the seat across from him. Mademoiselle, you have been most helpful, but I must ask you again, are you quite certain no one else had access to Dr. Fenley's journal? Clara hesitated. I didn't think so, but now... Yes. Clara wrung her hands. There was one night, 3 days before the gala. I found the archive door unlocked in the early morning. I assumed she'd forgotten to secure it, but now I'm not sure. Was anything missing then? Number, or at least nothing obvious. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And who had keys at that time? Only me and Rupert. But the master key could override any lock, which is held by Lady Venetia. Clara nodded. Poirot thanked her and dismissed her gently. Then, without pause, he requested another visitor, Professor Alton Greeley. The American entered with a tight expression, no longer haughty but suspicious. He was starting to feel the pressure. That was Poirot's design. You've summoned me again, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot gestured to the chair. Please, Professor, just one question. He paused a beat too long, just enough to create tension. Who said, I should have burned that letter when I had the chance? Greeley blinked. What? Poirot's tone did not change. At breakfast, it was said under breath, but I heard it. So did others. And I am quite certain the voice was yours. Greeley swallowed. You must be mistaken, I never said that. Poirot raised a brow. Then perhaps you can explain how a copy of Dr. Fenley's final letter, addressed to the British Museum, ended up crumpled in your bin? Greeley froze. That's impossible, he said. I never knew it was still there, Poirot interrupted. But you did read it, didn't you? You intercepted it before it could be posted. Poirot stepped forward slowly. You thought it might implicate you, or someone you were protecting. You panicked, but you didn't. Destroy it immediately, You held on to it, perhaps to weigh your options. The professor stood abruptly. I won't be accused. Sit, Poirot said, voice low, but iron hard. Greeley paused, then sat. The letter, Poirot continued, mentions discrepancies in the telescope's ownership chain, a contradiction between the provenance you provided and the war records Dr. Fenley cross-referenced. So what? Greeley muttered. It's a telescope, not the Mona Lisa. No, monsieur, it is more than that. It is a thread, one that leads to wartime theft, black market trades, and a name you were paid to protect. Poirot leaned in. Who paid you, Professor? Greeley was silent. Poirot watched him for a long moment. Then he stepped back. You may go, but I suggest you do not stray far. When Greeley had gone, Hastings, who had been listening quietly, said, You rattled him. Yes, Poirot said softly, but he is not the killer. What? Number he knows more than he admits, but his fear is academic. He fears disgrace, loss of reputation, but he does not fear discovery in the same way the murderer does. He turned to Barnes. There is one person left to confront, the person who had access to every room, every paper, every key, the one who stood closest to Fenley, and perhaps knew her intentions better than anyone. Rupert Darnley? Barnes asked. No. Poirot's eyes darkened. Clara Newton? Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The house was silent. Too silent. Poirot had retreated to the observatory's reading room after his confrontation with Professor Greeley. Hastings joined him there, sipping his tea with uncharacteristic restraint. Poirot had barely touched his own. You really think Clara Newton is involved? Hastings asked at last. I think she is not as innocent as she appears, Poirot said, eyes on the grandfather clock. She was closer to Margot Fenley than any of them. She had access, motive, and knowledge, yet she presented herself as merely the assistant, the trusted subordinate. He stood suddenly. And now, mon ami, it is nearly time. Time for what? Poirot didn't answer. Instead, he moved quickly and quietly through the hall, past the dining room, and out onto the east terrace. The air was cold. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. Hastings followed closely, confusion turning to tension. Poirot stopped short at the edge of the garden wall, where a narrow stone path curved toward the archive annex and the estate's incinerator. A figure was moving swiftly in the mist, hooded, carrying a small wooden box under one arm. Clara, Hastings whispered. Poirot nodded once. Bon, right on time. They watched in silence as she reached the incinerator, opened the heavy hatch, and knelt down. She placed the box inside, but before she could strike the match, Pardon, mademoiselle, Poirot called out softly, but that belongs to—
The dead. Clara gasped and dropped the match. It hissed as it landed on the damp stone. She turned, pale and shaking. Monsieur Poirot, what are you— Preventing the destruction of what is, I believe, Dr. Fenley's real journal, he said gently, stepping forward. Hastings moved around her, lifting the box from the hatch. Inside were notebooks, photographs, a thin bundle of old correspondence, and a small envelope addressed to the British Museum. I had no choice, Clara said, voice cracking. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Poirot replied. You were loyal to Margot Fenley, but when she found something dangerous, you panicked. You thought you could protect her reputation, or protect someone else. Clara's eyes welled with tears. I didn't kill her, I swear. I believe you, Poirot said softly. But you tried to erase her voice, her findings. That was your mistake. She looked down. I just wanted it to go away. The smuggling, the forgery, the people involved. She wrote everything down. Poirot looked at the box again. And now I have what I need. Suddenly a shout came from the path behind them. Rupert Darnley. What's going on here? Hastings stepped forward. Caught red-handed, Darnley. Your accomplice was about to destroy the evidence. I had nothing to do with that, Rupert said coldly. I told Clara to stay out of it. Poirot turned to him. But you knew, monsieur. You knew the telescope was not discovered, but planted. You knew it was not the original. I suspected, Rupert muttered. But I didn't kill anyone. No, Poirot said. But someone did. He held up the envelope with the British Museum seal. And soon I will prove who. Rupert stared at him, then turned and stalked away, his footsteps sharp against the stone. Clara slumped against the wall. What will happen to me? You will answer questions, Poirot said. But if you tell the truth, justice may yet be merciful. He turned to Hastings. Tonight, he said, we gather them all. The time has come to finish this. Chapter 14. The Final Piece. Falls into place night fell quickly over the Greaves Observatory, casting long shadows across the great dome and stone courtyard. Inside, a hush had settled like frost. The guests kept to themselves, the staff moved quietly, and Clara Newton remained in her room, under discreet watch by Inspector Barnes. Poirot sat alone in the study, the box retrieved from the incinerator open before him. The fire crackled softly. Hastings stood nearby, arms folded, watching as Poirot leafed through the last of Dr. Fenley's handwritten notes. So, Hastings said quietly, do you have it now? Poirot did not answer immediately. He pulled a thin sheet from the bottom of the stack, a page unlike the others. It was lined in red ink, folded in thirds, and bore no date. But its contents were
precise, clinical, and damning. The telescope was never recovered from Sicily. It was rerouted in 1946 to a private English estate, an unrecorded transfer under diplomatic protection. Recipient S.G. The object remained hidden for decades in a private vault beneath the greenhouse. Confirmed by coordinates and wartime manifests. One party has verified the seal. The item is real. Poirot laid the page on the desk. This, he said, is the final piece. Hastings leaned over it. S.G. again. Silas Greaves? Yes, Poirot said. But more importantly, it confirms that Margot Fenley knew the telescope was never truly discovered by Rupert. She traced its journey painstakingly, and she had evidence. He picked up another item from the box, a photograph. Faded and curled, it showed the telescope inside a different room, one that did not match the observatory's exhibition chamber. The original resting place, Poirot murmured. Not the display hall, but a hidden location, likely the carriage house. This was taken long before the gala unveiling. Poirot stood. Now I understand. Rupert staged the discovery to elevate the observatory, but someone else, someone deeper in the shadows, knew that if the telescope were verified publicly, questions would arise, and with questions came danger. He turned to Hastings, eyes sharp. Rupert is guilty of ambition, but the murderer is guilty of fear. Poirot walked to the window and stared out into the night. There is one last thing to confirm. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a small, delicate item, the photograph of the shipping crate found in the carriage house, taken hours earlier by Poirot himself. He placed it beside the photograph from Margot's journal. The crates were identical, except for one small discrepancy. The seal, Poirot whispered. Look, Hastings, one crate shows the Greaves monogram, clearly pressed into fresh wax, but the photograph from Margot's journal shows the seal already cracked, reaffirmed with glue. Meaning? Hastings blinked. Someone tried to reseal it after opening it? Exactement, Poirot smiled. The crate Rupert presented was tampered with, not by Rupert himself, but by someone who feared what the public unveiling might reveal, someone who wanted to switch the original with a copy, someone who knew Margot had found out. Hastings inhaled sharply. So, the killer was trying to hide the fact that the real telescope was never supposed to be seen. Poirot nodded. And now, he said, gathering the papers, I am ready. Hastings followed him to the door. Ready for what? Poirot glanced back, his expression calm, certain. For the truth, mon ami, and for the killer to hear it. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The drawing-room of the Greaves Observatory had been hastily rearranged for what felt like a tribunal. Chairs were set in a semicircle. The fireplace glowed faintly behind Poirot as he stood, hands clasped behind his back, waiting. Hastings watched the guests file in one by one, each carrying their own burden of nervousness. Lady Venetia was the first to enter, her mouth tight, a stiff brandy in hand. Rupert Darnley followed, looking pale and worn, his gaze flickering suspiciously from Poirot to the others. Professor Greeley entered next, frowning but silent. Archibald Crane, unusually quiet, kept glancing toward Clara Newton, who arrived last, escorted gently by Inspector Barnes. They took their seats. Poirot remained standing. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, voice calm, you are gathered here because the time has come for truth. You may feel uneasy, perhaps resentful, but one of you has committed murder, and I intend, with the help of my little grey cells, to reveal who. No one spoke. The room seemed to shrink with tension. Poirot turned and placed 3 items on the table before him. A photograph, a page of wartime records, and a sealed envelope. This case, you see, was never merely about a telescope. It was about what that telescope represented: legacy, wealth, history. And like all great objects of value, it was surrounded by lies. He gestured toward Rupert. Monsieur Darnley claimed to have discovered the telescope in the ruins of the Greaves estate's western wing. A charming story, one that would have earned him praise, attention, and a potential permanent post as director. Rupert straightened, but said nothing. But the truth is quite different, Poirot continued. Dr. Fenley discovered that the telescope had been in private possession for years, smuggled to England after the war and hidden here. She documented everything. He tapped the sealed envelope. She had intended to send this report to the British Museum. A copy of it was found burned, incompletely, in Professor Greeley's bin. Greeley opened his mouth, but Poirot raised a hand. I do not accuse you of murder, Professor, only cowardice. He turned next to Clara Newton. Mademoiselle Clara, you attempted to destroy Dr. Fenley's final journal. That, too, was cowardice, but not malice. You feared scandal. I believe your loyalty blinded you. Clara stared at the floor. Poirot moved to the photograph on the table. This image shows the telescope in the carriage house, long before its discovery. The crate bears a seal, which, as you will see in this other image, was clumsily reattached. Someone tampered with it. Someone who feared that if the telescope were examined by experts, the truth of its provenance would come out. Poirot's gaze swept the room. That person did not kill to protect Rupert, nor Clara, nor the legacy of Silas Greaves. He stepped closer to the fire, letting the flames cast shadows on the room. They killed to protect themselves, because their own name, their own war record, would be exposed. A hush fell. Poirot turned to Lady Venetia. You inherited this observatory, madame, but you also inherited the burden of what your father did, of how he acquired the telescope illegally from a Sicilian vault after the war. You knew that if Margot's report became public, the museum would trace the smuggling back to the estate. Venetia's face had gone pale. "You did not mean to kill her," Poirot said gently. "But you knew she took chamomile tea every night. It was easy enough to slip in a poison, one that mimicked natural causes. And when that failed to pass unnoticed, you attempted to destroy the evidence with Clara's unwitting help." Venetia's hand trembled, the brandy glass tipping slightly. Poirot walked slowly back to the centre of the room. "The pieces fit, Madame Venetia. Motive, means, opportunity, the forgery of the seal, the war records, the desire to protect your father's name, and your own." A long silence followed. Then a whisper. "Prove it." Poirot gave a small, sad smile. "I already have." Chapter 16. The Reveal. "You say you've proven it," Lady Venetia said, her voice brittle. "But where is this proof, Monsieur Poirot? Do you expect them?" She gestured to the room. "To take your word for it?" Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "No, madame. I expect them to consider the logic." He turned slowly toward the group, allowing the weight of his words to hang. "Let us begin with motive. Dr. Fenley's discovery, if published, would have connected the smuggled telescope not to Rupert Darnley, nor to any forgery committed by outsiders, but directly to the wartime activities of Silas Greaves himself, your father. A man lauded in public, but whose private dealings included the unlawful procurement of cultural artifacts under diplomatic immunity. It was his crime, but you feared it would stain your name." Venetia didn't respond, but her eyes narrowed. Poirot continued, "You inherited not only the observatory, but a legacy you felt compelled to protect. You funded the gala, supported the telescope's discovery, even oversaw the creation of forged documents to fake its journey." "Baseless!" Venetia snapped. "You can't prove I forged anything." Poirot smiled faintly. "But I can prove you had access to every document involved. You held the master keys, you controlled the archive. You were the only one who could both forge and later lose the originals." He tapped the sealed envelope again. "This letter, Margot's final report, was never sent. It was intercepted. She likely told you about it in confidence, never suspecting betrayal. But you saw what it meant." Poirot stepped forward. "So you poisoned her tea, camphor and aconitine, a calculated dosage to mimic heart failure in someone with mild arrhythmia." A gasp came from Clara. Venetia's lips pressed thin. Poirot's voice softened. "It almost worked. But the problem, madam, was that you could not stop there. The telescope still existed, the document still existed, and you feared what would happen when someone noticed the tampered seal." He held up the photograph again. "You reapplied it, but poorly. And that, madame, was your mistake. Margot photographed it before you did so. The wax markings do not match. You tried to rewrite the past, but history had already been recorded." Venetia stared at him, unblinking. "You still lack proof," she said quietly. Poirot tilted his head. "No, madame. You lack denial." She blinked. Poirot turned to Inspector Barnes. "Have you the results of the lab test?" Barnes nodded, stepping forward. "Yes, we had the tea strainer from Dr. Fenley's room tested for toxins. The results came back this morning. Traces of aconitine were present, consistent with sustained exposure." A ripple went through the room. "And," Barnes continued, "we lifted fingerprints from the tin kept in her drawer. 2 sets, Dr. Fenley's and yours, Lady Venetia." Venetia stood slowly, the brandy glass still in hand. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, "I did what I had to." Crane inhaled sharply. Venetia turned to the group, her voice eerily calm. "My father built this place. It was his pride, his legacy, and yes, he made mistakes, but I wouldn't let Margot destroy that. She didn't understand what was at stake. None of you do. Reputation, history. It doesn't survive on truth. It survives on belief. Poirot's voice was quiet. And now it will survive with justice. Venetia's shoulders sagged. The firelight flickered on her face. She set the glass down gently on the mantel and looked at Poirot. I suppose this is the part where I'm arrested. Poirot nodded solemnly. Inspector Barnes stepped forward. Venetia didn't resist. As she was led from the room, the others sat in stunned silence. Poirot turned to the fire and in a quiet voice said, "It is always the same. The human heart, so full of pride and fear, commits the gravest crimes in the name of something noble." Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The drawing-room remained hushed long after Lady Venetia was escorted away. No one spoke. The silence was thick, as though every breath was laced with the weight of all that had been revealed. Poirot sat in his armchair now, composed as ever, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. Clara Newton was the first to rise. Her expression was unreadable, but the faintest shimmer in her eyes betrayed a quiet storm of guilt and relief. "I thought I was protecting her," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "But I was only helping to hide a murder." Poirot looked up at her gently. "Mademoiselle, the human instinct to protect what we love is strong, but when that instinct blinds us to the truth, it becomes dangerous." Clara nodded slowly, her voice small. "What happens to me now?" Inspector Barnes, standing near the door, stepped forward. "You'll give a full statement. But Poirot believes, and I agree, that you were misled. Aiding in the disposal of evidence is serious, but context matters. It always does." Clara gave a slight, grateful nod and sat back down. Rupert Darnley stood next. His face, once proud and eager, looked weathered and hollow. "I wanted to make something of myself," he said quietly. "My family's never produced anything remarkable. When I found the telescope in the old greenhouse vault, I thought, this is it. I didn't even know it had been hidden for decades." Poirot tilted his head. "You were ambitious, monsieur, not a criminal, but your silence allowed a far worse crime to flourish." Rupert sighed. "I'll resign, of course." "No," Poirot said. "You will stay, and you will tell the truth, restore the observatory's history honestly, so that what was once hidden does not remain buried in lies." Professor Greeley gave a snort from the corner. "That's noble, Poirot, but people don't want complicated legacies. They want clean heroes and simple stories." Poirot gave a faint smile. "Then perhaps it is time we give them reality instead." Inspector Barnes cleared his throat. "Lady Venetia has already confessed. With the evidence we've gathered, a prosecution will be swift. Her father's wartime dealings may come under posthumous scrutiny, but it's justice. Finally, after decades." Poirot rose and walked to the window, looking out at the dome of the observatory against the night sky. "Do you know why the telescope mattered so much?" he asked quietly. Hastings stepped beside him. "Because it was stolen?" Poirot shook his head. "Because it was watched. All those years it was there, unseen, but always near. And once it came into the light, it forced the truth from the shadows." He turned. "As with all crimes, mon ami, the moment someone dares to examine closely, that is when the truth comes into focus." Archibald Crane, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. "And what of the observatory's future?" Poirot looked at him. "That, monsieur, depends on your honesty and your courage." Crane nodded solemnly. The fire crackled behind them, a low rhythmic pulse. Poirot turned to Hastings. "It is finished." Hastings smiled faintly. You've done it again, old friend. Poirot gave a modest shrug. Ah, but it was not merely the crime, it was the psychology behind it. Pride, guilt, and the desperate need to rewrite history. His eyes softened. In the end, even the stars cannot hide what the heart refuses to forget. Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. 2 days had passed since the night of revelations. The observatory was quiet now, stripped of its gala banners, its halls cleared of guests and tension. The exhibit room, once filled with anticipation and deception, now displayed only a cordoned-off telescope, a placard nearby stating, "Temporarily under review by the British Museum." Poirot stood beside the large bay window of the guest wing, a cup of strong Belgian coffee in hand, his gaze turned to the horizon where the countryside rolled into the mist. Hastings entered quietly behind him, suitcase in hand, bowler hat tucked beneath one arm. "They're preparing the carriage," Hastings said. "Inspector Barnes left early this morning, and Rupert's been asked to give a public statement at the end of the week." Poirot nodded slowly. A good decision. He must begin with honesty. "And Clara?" "She will not be charged," Poirot replied. "Inspector Barnes is recommending leniency. Her involvement, while misguided, was rooted in loyalty, not malice." Hastings let out a long breath. "And Lady Venetia?" "She has been moved to a holding facility in London. Solicitors are already spinning stories about emotional distress, inherited trauma and misguided judgment. But the facts, mon ami, they do not bend." Hastings was silent a moment, then gave a rueful smile. "You always said, the truth is patient, it waits." Poirot turned from the window and took a seat by the fireplace. "Oui, truth does not shout, Hastings. It whispers. It waits for someone who listens." He tapped the armrest thoughtfully. "So many crimes," he continued, "begin not with hatred but with fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of losing one's name, one's place in the world. Lady Venetia did not hate Margot Fenley. She feared her." Hastings nodded slowly. "And now that fear has destroyed everything she tried to protect?" Poirot smiled faintly. "There is an irony, is there not? In preserving a lie, she unravelled the very legacy she hoped to protect." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire flickering low, the observatory staff moving quietly beyond the hall. Eventually, Poirot stood and adjusted his cuffs with precision. "It is time." As they made their way to the car waiting outside, several members of the staff offered respectful nods. Clara Newton stood by the entrance, her hands clasped, eyes still red from long hours of reflection. "Thank you," she said softly to Poirot. He paused, then offered a small bow. "Mademoiselle, you now hold the threads of this place's future. Let it be one of truth." She nodded. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, a rare and golden light glancing off the metal dome of the observatory. The world, it seemed, was trying to return to order. As the car pulled away from the estate, Hastings turned toward Poirot. "One thing still puzzles me." "Ah, bon," Poirot said with amusement. "A final question before the curtain falls. You never explained how you were certain about the tampered seal, before we even confirmed it with the photos." Poirot leaned back, the corners of his moustache twitching. "Because, Hastings, when Lady Venetia described the crate at dinner, 3 nights before the confrontation, she mentioned the wax seal as intact, but Margot Fenley had already shown Clara a cracked seal weeks earlier. Lady Venetia could only have seen it resealed. That small error, an assumption of detail, betrayed her." Hastings blinked. "But she was so composed." Poirot smiled. "As are all great liars, mon ami, until they speak just one word too many." He turned his gaze to the rolling hills. "Such is the art of detection, not only to observe, but to listen to what the world tries to hide. Crimes like stars may seem distant, but bring the right lens. He tapped his temple, and one sees everything. The car rolled on, leaving behind the observatory, the shadows of the past, and a story in which one stolen object revealed far more than anyone ever imagined.